Now, more than 7 months into Israel's war against Hamas because of the terrorist event that took place on October 7th, Israel doesn't appear to be any closer to success than they were at the outset. And in fact, at least on the political front, from the perspective of Israel, they suffered a pretty significant setback today in that the International Criminal Court has ruled just about an hour or so ago that Israel must halt its operation in Rafah while investigations can continue on to see if there is credible evidence of a genocide going on among the Palestinian people. Now, of course, many in the world will hail this outcome and say, yes, it's long overdue. It should have happened before. The ICC is a binding agreement, but only in name. It doesn't have any real impact because there's no enforcement mechanism. It's not anything that Israel would even consider listening to. Of course, they're going to continue to go on with their Rafah operation as they've moved out nearly 1 million people already from the area. And by all accounts, they're actually in the early stages of continuing on with this operation in Rafah, according to Netanyahu, to get rid of the final 4 battalions and finally bring peace to Israel. Now, of course, as I've been telling you from day one, that the path that Netanyahu is on is not going to succeed. He's going to end up costing himself and his people long-term difficulties and security challenges that will probably dwarf what they experienced on the 6th of October going forward. Now, also, you've seen on this show many times, we talk about the reasons why. And I say you can't kill your way out of an insurgency. You can't kill your way to peace. I also say that if you don't have at least a viable possibility for the people, for Palestine, if they don't see any reason at all to peacefully coexist with Israel, then you're not going to have peace for the people of Israel, whether you kill every single one of the Hamas fighters or not. So those are the things that I've consistently said, and I think that you see them playing out here. You've also very frequently seen me take to task David Petraeus, former general, former CIA director, who comes across and is presented all the time as a subject matter expert. And one of the key claims for him, which is often cited, is his so-called success in the 2006-2007 Iraq surge. That's really where he got his big claim to fame, because by all accounts, what he did on the ground there completely changed the dynamics of that. It dropped the violence by 90%, and what had been an intractable insurgency. After Petraeus came in with this big surge, everything was completely turned around, and 3 years later, Obama withdrew all of the American forces. That's the way it looks on the surface. And so now then, of course, it makes sense from the media perspective. Well, let's go to the guy who was successful, who was uniquely successful in fighting a terrorist entity, whether that was Al-Qaeda, whether it was a Sunni insurgency, or whether it's Hamas. It's basically just a different name for the same kind of enemy. So it makes sense from a media perspective. Let's ask his advice on this. So that has happened quite a few times here, and I've heard about it, throughout the 7 months. I keep seeing Petraeus pop up, but a couple of days ago, he was on the CNN show GPS with Fareed Zakaria, and Zakaria has known Petraeus for quite a large number of years. When he was working for CNN earlier, after the 2003 Iraq war, when the United States went in there, he had gone and was in the headquarters of Petraeus when he was a 2-star division commander at the time, and he's going to refer to that during this interview that we just saw here. I pulled out a couple of parts here because I think it is absolutely vital to explain what the common understanding of what happened in 2006, 2007 is not accurate. And even though it has partial accurate interpretations of what happened, some of the things that Petraeus says are true. And I'm going to talk about both the what's right and what's not right. But the parts that are wrong are absolutely crucial to understand, because if you're going to try and apply a template of something that by all accounts worked in 2007, and you want to see it work here, you have to understand what was right and what was wrong. Because if you apply the wrong template, if you apply the wrong solution to a situation that is radically different in a couple of key areas here, then you're going to actually make the situation worse. And that is what I have been trying emphatically to say has been going on with Israel right now. And especially because Israel is on the cusp of starting what they're claiming is going to be their final major battle of this war. And the expectation that so many have is that, okay, now then the U.S. is helping them. Now then the U.S. is, Biden is no longer talking about withholding the weapons. So the expectation is among many in the West, in the United States in particular, in Israel, that now then there can finally be an end in sight. Now then there is finally going on. So Fareed Zakaria again went to Petraeus to ask him basically to give your assessment of what's going on right now. So I'm going to show you some of the key parts of what Petraeus said there. And I'm going to go back to a 2010 article, actually a pair of them, that I wrote for the Armed Forces Journal after my one and only interview with Petraeus. I actually got him on the phone and interviewed him for this article that came out in, I think it was September of 2010. And I asked, some of his very pointed questions about what had happened here, how this thing worked. And I interviewed the brigade commander for one of the key American brigade commanders from the 1st Armored Division. That was at the absolute heart of everything that happened in the so-called Sunni Awakening, which was instrumental in ending the horrible violence that was going on there. It did genuinely help to end that, to drop the violence by 90% and allow us to leave. So the net result is what you think it was. We did leave. But what actually happened is really important to understand here. And ironically, I actually published 2 articles, one month after the other, one in September, one in October, where in September, I talked about what did happen in Iraq. And then the next month, I talked about what happens if you apply the wrong lessons to Afghanistan. And as we know, we did apply the wrong policies to Afghanistan, and we paid a price. Israel is on the same path to pay a price here if they don't make some big changes. And I don't have a lot of hope that that's going to happen, but at least you're going to know ahead of time what's going right and what's going wrong and why it's almost certain to fail if they keep going down their current path. So first of all, let's take a look at what Petraeus said in answer to a question of, what was the key parts of the success of the surge in 2007 and 2006, 2007. And here's what Petraeus said.
Well, first and foremost, we committed to making life better for innocent Iraqi civilians, and we pledged that we would get al-Qaeda, an extremist group irreconcilable, similar to Hamas, out of their midst. We would clear their neighborhoods, their cities of al-Qaeda, and then we would keep them out of those cities and neighborhoods. We'd create gated communities, 12 of them alone in Fallujah, which was already completely encircled by cement to keep them out. And then you have biometric ID cards. We would flood the area immediately with humanitarian assistance, then restore basic services, and then keep the pressure on those groups, constantly going after them after having cleared comprehensively from the populated areas. But the key was the hold and the build. We're seeing in Gaza the clearing. The problem is if you don't hold, again, keep the people separate from, in this case, Hamas, which is, again, an extremist group akin to the Islamic State. It's irreconcilable. But if you don't separate them from the population and keep them separate, you're going to have to go back and re-clear because extremist groups, if they're not kept out, will reconstitute.
Okay, so he's partially right there, and I give him credit for that. As I did in this 2010 article, which I'm going to show you in a minute, and I've got, by the way, I've got the link in the description of this, so you can go back and read the whole thing at your leisure whenever you have a chance. He is partially right, and I don't hesitate to give him credit where he's right, and part of that is right. So what he did was to recognize what was happening on the ground and saying, all right, let's basically cordon the thing off. Let's create some barriers so that people can't move freely across. Then you'll clear one militarily, and then you'll keep it clear. And then you'll, in this case, they had Iraqi security forces that would hold an area after U.S. forces primarily had cleared it. Now, that makes sense because if the bad guys can't get back in, then you can say, all right, this one's clear. We're going to move on to the next one. That makes sense. And if you want to help the people in the part of that, and if you, this is crucial, if you conduct those clearing operations in the way that wants to get rid of the terrorists and to kill the bad guys while not wiping out the infrastructure and taking care of the people and bringing in relief supplies, so that you're showing them we care about you. We want the the end result of this to be a place where you can live in peace. That is so important, and what genuinely did help the situation in 2006, 2007. Now, what do you think is going to happen if instead of clearing the bad guys out, the military force comes in and kills everyone, or just wipes out everything without any recognition to anything else? And in fact, not only doesn't give enough relief supplies, but actually blocks it in some cases. How interested do you think those people are going to be to help the government forces, or in this case, the Israeli forces? Not very likely. Now, the next part here that that Petraeus goes into is that he kind of leaves out an important part here, really important part that he has not said anything up to this point. So what he's told you so far, and he told Fareed, was that it was basically a clear, hold, and build. You may recall that phrase before, which says, we took this chaotic situation, we parceled it out, and then we went in there and started getting the bad guys out and helping the population. That's kind of the narrative. Not exactly what did happen. And the next part here he's talking about is that he says, well, there's a better way than what other people were doing. Here we go.
So again, reaching out to the Sunnis and saying, look, your lives have not been particularly good with al-Qaeda and these Sunni insurgents in your midst and in your neighborhoods. We're going to help you get them out. At the very least, don't oppose us. At the very best, let's reconcile. We ultimately reconciled with as many as 80,000 former Sunni insurgents and others, many of them just in the wrong place at the wrong time and trying to survive. And then we did the same actually with the Shia militia supported by Iran, about 23,000 of them. We did it initially directly with them. Eventually, we were able to hand it off and get the Iraqi government to embrace that as well. I do think it is an example for this situation.
So he thinks, and stated very directly, that what he did by convincing the people to work with the government, convincing the people that their future lie better working with the government than it did with the insurgents. And he thinks that that's applicable here. Here's the crucial part. Here's what he did not mention at any point during this, which I emphatically brought up during this, the article in the interview that I had with him, and included some interviews with the people who were actually participating. I talked to both American commanders, First Armored Division, a brigade commander, and a talk with two of the people who were at the time insurgent opponents of the United States side. Through some sources that I had, I was actually able to interview some of the what was the Sunni insurgent leaders. So I got it directly from the horse's mouth exactly what happened. And there was remarkable continuity between what they told me and what the American ground commander told me. And that's the part that Petraeus leaves out, which is indispensable with understanding how things worked out and why they worked out. And if you're going to try and apply this template, you have to try this part, because without it, we would not have succeeded. Point blank. That's not just my opinion. That's also the opinion of the brigade commander in there. And here's what happened. So at the time, there was actually four main parties to this. There was the United States, there was the Iraqi Sunni insurgents, the former Ba'athists who were loyal to Saddam. There was the Sunni Shia. There was the Iraqi Shia, who had been the minority under Saddam, but now had been elevated to the leadership position by the Coalition Provisional Authority, and al-Qaeda. So there was what's called al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI. So those four components were all in the mix to this violent cauldron of death and destruction that was in Iraq following our invasion in 2003. The al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Sunni insurgencies should have been natural allies, because they're both Sunni Islam. They should have been united against both the United States, the invaders in their view, and the Shia, who they all have had a long-standing antipathy between. But al-Qaeda in Iraq had a globalist view, and the Sunni insurgents had a nationalist view. They just wanted the U.S. out of their country, and they wanted to get rid of the Shia again. They wanted to be dominant again. So they had a nationalistic view. And that clashed with the international, the globalist view of the al-Qaeda side. And at first it was just a dispute, but then Al-Qaeda overplayed their hand and said they started then killing the Sunni insurgents. And then they started really killing them in large numbers in just brutal, horrific ways, like what you've seen with ISIS, how they did to many of their victims. They did to their own co-religionists there. The Sunnis, who had been former Baathists and former Saddam people, came to a conclusion that if we don't do something quick, we're going to be wiped out. Because just think, at that point, they were being killed by Al-Qaeda, they were being killed by the Shia, and they were being killed by the Americans because they were going against them. 3-1, they're not going to win that. And they could see that they were going to get wiped out. So one of their leaders said, okay, one of their tribal leaders and tribal, the Iraqi government and country is a very tribal based instinct. It's not just this nationalist deal. There's a lot of different tribes with different historical allegiances, etc. One of the key guys said to himself, hey, we're going to have to do something different, and approached the United States and said, hey, what if we both hate Al-Qaeda? What if I get my tribe and we turn against Al-Qaeda and help you and give you information from inside Iraq that you're never going to get on your own and could not get? And we both go after Al-Qaeda, our common enemy. And they said, and then we won't shoot you anymore. We won't shoot Americans. We'll stop shooting Americans and we'll all shoot the Al-Qaeda. And the United States said, that sounds like a good deal. Petraeus saw this. And again, here's where he deserves credit. He went in there originally to much fanfare about trying this whole clear hold and bill thing and winning hearts and minds. That was his plan when he went in there. And that's what they had tried. Others had already been trying that to no real success, even before Petraeus got there, but he had to try something. When Petraeus got wind of what had happened here, and the guy that approached him, Colonel McFarland, then Colonel McFarland, later General, who was commander of the 1st Brigade, 1st Army Division, brought this Petraeus and said, hey, what do you think about this? This is what we want to do. He makes sense. Petraeus properly recognized a tremendous opportunity and reinforced it and said, yes, let's go down this path. So we started just absolutely supporting everything. And they eventually got them on the payroll. Now, when Petraeus a minute ago says that they had like 80,000 reconciles, they didn't actually reconcile with anything. They just said, hey, we'll go on your payroll. So the West actually started paying the Sunnis, the insurgent Sunnis, to be on their side and to give them go. They called them Sons of Iraq and several other kinds of names that they gave them, putting them on the government payroll, basically. And of course, we also put pressure on the Shia, who were in charge, to stop fighting amongst themselves, which they also did. And so you see that this had this opportunity that now that instead of 3-1 against the Sunnis, now that it's 3-1 against Al-Qaeda. And so everybody was now against Al-Qaeda, and it turned out to be really successful. But in the 2010 article that I wrote, I pointed out that here's what McFarland, the article was called The Spark, Oxygen, and Fuel. In it, I said that you can't get a fire unless you have all three elements: the spark, oxygen, and something to burn. So it wasn't just the surge by itself. You had to have other things. You had to have the intelligence, and you had to have the cooperation of one of the components, one of the fighters in the battle. And so it took all three of them. The surge by itself wasn't alone. Those people by themselves weren't alone. It did take all that to be able to get the outcome that we wanted. And in the article, McFarland, that was the colonel that was in charge, he says the Iraqi people were a critical part of the turnaround. I give huge credit to the Iraqis who stood up to Al-Qaeda. Maybe 75 to 80% of the credit for the success of the counterinsurgency fight in Ramadi goes to the Iraqi people who stood up to Al-Qaeda and joined us in common cause. Without the intel provided by the awakening groups, our job would have been vastly more difficult. We could have gone into an area and over time cleared it and slowly but surely taken control of it. But if the Iraqi Sunnis had remained allied with Al-Qaeda against us, we would not have been able to achieve anything of lasting or strategic consequence. Now, in the article that I published the very next month, I pointed out that was a significant difference with trying to apply this same pattern into Afghanistan, which Petraeus did, because he said it worked here, it'll work here. But there was no correlation in the Afghanistan situation where one part of the insurgency turned against another part on the United States, on behalf of the United States, and gave the intelligence on how to get the rest of it. Absent that part, then you see in 2010, Colonel McFarland accurately said, without that, we would never have been able to win because we're a strong power. We can go in there against these, guys who are basically armed with roadside bombs and rifles or RPGs. And that's about it. We can go in there and clear anything, but it's like putting your hand, a big fist, into a bucket of water. The water is powerless to stop the hand. You can go in there and it will displace the water and it'll get out of the way. But the second you pull your hand out of that bucket, all the water rolls back in and it's as though your hand was never there. That's exactly what happened in Afghanistan and what would have happened in 2006 Iraq had we not had that thing changed. And there's one other element of that. Gary, if you can throw that next call out up. According to two Sunni Arab leaders supporting the American military operation against AQI at the time, was based on the fact that the Sunnis' hatred of al-Qaeda had finally eclipsed their hatred of America. Retired Major General Najim Jabouri, the mayor of Tal Afar in 2005, that's an Iraqi city, told me that the Sunnis in 2006 Ramadi would have worked with the devil to get rid of al-Qaeda. What's important to understand in there is that the Sunnis didn't quit hating us. They just found somebody that they hated more. And so they were able to and willing to temporarily work with the devil. And guess who the devil was in that scenario? It was us, to get rid of the worst devil, which was al-Qaeda, who was going to wipe them out. If you can find something like that in any kind of insurgency, then you actually have a chance to succeed. Now, the one in Iraq ultimately didn't succeed either because the Shia government we left in charge after we left turned against the Sunnis, what was the Sunni insurgency, the Sons of Iraq and all of that, and began to purge them from all the power ministries. They began to abuse them again now that they had the power, and that directly led to the arisal of ISIS. And so 3 years after we left, that whole thing had metastasized again and turned out because now then the conditions changed. And so you see how even that was only a temporary situation. What's happening in Israel right now is even worse because, number one, the government is not trying to help the people. They're not trying to isolate Hamas from the Palestinian people. And there would have at least been a theoretical possibility had they done that. Had Israel followed the actual pattern for what happened in 2006 and 7 Iraq and said, okay, we're going to help the Palestinian population. We're going to take care of it. We're going to go into areas that we're going to clear it, and we're going to protect the people. We're going to give them relief supplies. We're going to give them everything they need. We're only going to target the Hamas people, and we're going to leave the rest alone and protect it as much as we can. And we're going to rebuild areas that get destroyed. If they had done that, it would have still been a really heavy lift because of so much animosity and hatred among the Palestinian people for the decades of enslavement, or not enslavement, I'm sorry, incarceration that had happened prior to that since 1948. I don't know that it would have succeeded, but there would have been a possibility. Instead, the worst possible outcome happens is that they don't care about the population. They're not even trying to separate the fighters from it. They're trying to basically call them all the same, and they're wiping out the ability of those people to live. Now, in that environment, what do you think is going to happen? The same thing that did happen in Afghanistan, but much, much worse, because even in Afghanistan, we still tried to take care of the population. We still tried to have targeted operations and not just wipe out entire portions of cities. We never did that. And Israel, of course, is doing it on a routine basis, which I've shown you before. But now, to give credit where credit is due, there is one other thing where Petraeus does say in this interview something to Zechariah, which I completely agree with. Here it is.
There were two signs, actually. One was, what have we done for the Iraqi people today? And then the second was, will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct? If the answer to that is no, in other words, you're not going to take more off than you create, you're supposed to retool the operation and figure out how to get to yes, without which you go sit under a tree until the thought passes. So how you carry this out matters enormously. You've got to demonstrate your concern for the people. And this is why I mentioned up front that it would be very helpful if the Israeli leadership at the very top would say, we want to make their life better.
And I've said that from the outset. So in that regard, Petraeus and I are of one mind. So I want to give credit where it's due. I don't want to just say that everything he says is bad. It's not. And that's one of the examples where I could say right there, if the Israeli government would listen to that part of his advice, then they would again have a better chance here. But I'm going to give you one other piece of expert advice from someone else who has a very similar viewpoint on that. And that is former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster. Now, you also know that I've not hesitated to point out some of the things that he said that's not right. But in 2005, while the rest of the U.S. Army was just having a terrible time with the insurgency, McMaster did it right in a place called Talofer. And he had isolated it off. He had sealed it off from everybody else. And then they methodically went in there and actually did a great job in clearing out the insurgents, identifying the terrorists that were there from the people, protecting the people. And he had some buy-in by the local people as well, the local leaders, and he showed everything that he could to take care of the people. Now, I'm not sure why he doesn't carry those same lessons that he had learned and apply them today, because he's kind of doing some very strange things. But here he was, I believe 14 years ago, when he was talking about this on the Charlie Rose show, saying what was right.
Now, it's an important capability in a counterinsurgency to go after the enemy's network, gain visibility of it, and attack it. But really, you're not going to win, because the key battleground in this war is the battleground of perception. And I think that's the second thing I'd say that we all learned very early, is that this is important. It's immensely important to clarify your own intentions, to counter the enemy's disinformation, right, and to help the Iraqi government and security forces bolster their legitimacy with their populations, so you can achieve sustainable security.
Achieve sustainable security. That is what is absolutely essential anytime you have a fight like this. If you're not going into a fight like this without a plan for how to achieve sustainable security, you're undermining your own security and building the foundations for insecurity later and more violence against your people. That's just the heart of it. You see, there's Petraeus, H.R. McMaster saying the same things back when they were actually just talking about what was actually happening. It's something I continue to say, and it's very practical. It's very rational. It's logical. It makes sense. But we, too many in the West, I mean, not categorize everyone together, doesn't care about the fundamentals. They only care about the emotions. We want to succeed. We want Israel to do whatever they want to do, and we want it to work. And we want them to have peace and security. It's a separate issue that there's not enough people care about Palestinian security and the innocent people in that, millions of people who equally deserve peace and security and a future and a hope. Unfortunately, not enough people talk about that. But if you just want to be just kind of myopic and only look at Israel security, even then, you've got to say this is not going to work rationally, logically. This is not a hard one to figure out. This is not just, well, I think the color blue is better. No, he thinks color red is better. That's nothing, anything. It's provable. That's just a personal opinion and a preference. This is not like that. This is very practical, fundamental, foundational principles that have applied almost routinely throughout centuries of warfare and of this kinds of battle especially. And it makes sense if you stop and think about it. And in the 2010 piece that I wrote, I actually addressed that point as well. Gary, if you can throw that last one up there. I wrote that time, resources, and competing requirements, including domestic political realities, make winning counterinsurgency fights extremely hard for the U.S. The clock is always ticking. In the Iraqi surge, the timings worked out to our advantage. Had al-Qaeda not worked at cross purposes with what should have been their natural Sunni allies, there would have been little reason for the Sunnis to awaken and work with the coalition forces. That's kind of the same thing that McMaster was saying there. He was saying they had to give them a reason to work together. But there is this political reality. Had the United States not done what we ended up doing in 2007, in other words, had al-Qaeda not overplayed its hand and done something stupid that harmed their own interest, and we benefited from it. And like McFarland had said, absent that, we could have cleared an area, but we couldn't have achieved anything sustainable. If that had happened, then the clock would have continued to tick. And as soon as the 1st Armored Division moved out, they brought in somebody else, you would still have had the same battle. it would never have stopped. The same impetus that was really working against President Bush at the time, and what made him take this chance and this risk with with launching the surge. And in case you might not be familiar with it, some of us may not be who didn't live through this. He was under enormous political pressure. And so many people, especially in the Democratic side, were against him. They were saying, what you're doing is dumb. It's not going to make any sense. It's not going to work. You're just getting us dragged into another Vietnam and all this kind of stuff. The surge ended all of that, just completely shut it down. But had that not happened, had it not turned out the way it did, and it did devolve into a continued, another festering kind of situation, then all of Bush's domestic political events would have also suffered, and we probably would have had suffered another embarrassing withdrawal like we did from Vietnam. It would have probably been something like that. The casualties would have continued to roll up there, and we would have created nothing of even operational significance, which we ended up doing there for at least 3 years before the Iraqi government actually squandered everything that we had given them and every opportunity that we had had. But that's a matter for a second issue. What matters right now is what's going on here in Israel. And for these very fundamental reasons, Israel is right now in the process of going into Rafah, where Benjamin Netanyahu continues to claim that the final 4 battalions, however identified, that he claims, once he takes them out, then they're going to be increased and the war is going to be over. Well, it's not going to be. It's not going to be, because the population is now 100% dependent upon external aid for survival, just mere survival. So even after he's finished here, it's going to be so many years into the future before there's even the possibility of getting this place rebuilt into any semblance of a life. What do you think is going to happen to the people? What would you feel like? Answer this question for yourself. What would you feel like if that all you could do is survive? You didn't have a job because there is me. You don't have the ability to travel, to have any sort of freedom. You're going to have an occupying army that's going to be watching over you, and the only food you can get is what's delivered by humanitarian means. Are you going to be okay with that? Are you going to say, well, I'll just become pacified, I'll work with the Israeli government? Would you say that? Of course you wouldn't. You're going to be in misery. Any human being on the planet, any time in history, would be the exact same way. So you understand, if you're even a little bit putting yourself in the side of the Palestinians, even if you don't like the Palestinians, there is no chance Israel is going to have security if they keep following this path. So instead of getting mad at anybody who says we want to require Israel to use our weapons and our ammunition in ways that have a chance of succeeding for Israel, all you're doing is encouraging Israel to go down a path to its harm. And that is where we are today. And look, folks, I've been pulling these fundamentals out since 2010, and they played out exactly the way I said they would in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's playing out exactly the way I'm talking about in both the Russia-Ukraine war on the fundamentals and here in Israel. These things aren't hard to figure out if you take the emotion out and you just look at the realities on the ground. This is what it is. So if you're for Israel, if you want to bring peace to the Jewish people in the country of Israel, then you need to support reining back the current Israeli government and in their leadership, because they're going down a path. I don't care how much you like them, how much you hate Palestine. It's not going to work out for the people that you care about. Now, I care about all of them. I want the Israeli people, I want the Jews to be able to live in peace and security, not have to worry about rockets raining down on their heads or terrorists breaking out of gates. I want them to have peace and security. Simultaneously, I want the Palestinian people to have peace and security and not have to be trapped inside of a gate, to not have to worry about an invading army coming in every several number of years. Everyone deserves to have peace. There is a path to where it's possible. Now, because of all the things that happened on October 7th and in the 7 months since, it's going to be just nightmarishly difficult. If I were placed in charge and given dictatorial powers and everything that I said could happen, it would be nightmarishly difficult now because of the damage done. There's no way around that. That's just the truth of it. But what I can tell you is, if you don't at least try and you don't get on the right path, then you're causing harm and difficulty for the very people that you care about, however, whichever side that happens to be, or both sides. It's time to do something different. Folks, I'm telling you the hard truth here. And if it makes some people mad, I'm sorry that it does, but it doesn't change the reality any. And we all have to take a hard look at this. And that means the supporters of Israel on our side, the supporters of Palestine, the supporters of just a general peace in the Middle East. It's time to do something different and quit just following this path of the least resistance by the side that has the most power and can just do whatever they want, because that'll work for a while. It won't work long term. It won't give you sustainable peace. And that's your deep dive for today. Thanks. And we've got one coming up for you later this afternoon. You're definitely not going to want to miss this one. Ted Postal is going to be back, an MIT professor, and we're going to look at what would happen if a limited nuclear attack happens in the Russia-Ukraine war. We know that the Russia side right now is in the process of conducting a non-strategic nuclear exercise, which is just another way to say tactical nuclear weapons that they would use. And I assure you, they definitely mean that they would do that. We're going to look at today what a limited nuclear strike in the region would look like. And it ain't going to be pretty, folks, but you don't want to miss it, because again, this is the ground truth. Be sure to like and subscribe. Share this with your friends. Let anybody know 1 o'clock today. They don't want to be anywhere besides Daniel Davis Deep Dive. And we'll see you then.